All right, got in under the wire. 1 second left before it hit 101. I enjoyed Nick Caserio's press conference. One moment here, and earmuffs, kids. I didn't have time to bleep this out. I've got several of the clips that I liked from Nick Caserio's press conference. As you all know, he tends to expand on his ideas. So I cut down 5 that jumped out at me. I'll probably do a follow-up to this at some point. But there was one light moment that you might have missed if you didn't stick around for the whole time, as Sarge was asking Nick about maybe addressing some of the mistakes he's made in the past and how to rectify them.
Made some mistakes in the past. I'm not going to ask you about those mistakes. I'm just going to ask you.
You guys fucking talk about them all the time. So.
Yeah, we do. That's right. I feel bad because the audio of that is going to sound way harsher than it actually was, where I think Nick was being pretty cool about it. But he touched on a few things specific to the Texans where he's not going to divulge a whole lot, and we can try to pick up the breadcrumbs and read into it too much. I did think one of the more interesting things he talked about was when he talked about mock drafts and how teams might use mock drafts to try to figure out where guys are not going to be in the draft. Because some GMs will flat out act like, no, I'm above all that. Like Nick's more open about that part of it.
And look, there's 4,000 mock drafts that are out there. Honestly, I don't know which one's right, which one's wrong. I mean, somebody can probably analyze that. But all right, there's a million mock drafts. I would just say some are probably more relevant than others because some are getting the information from the teams. Like they're not just making it up themselves. Like they're talking to teams saying, hey, so that's how they're building it, right? So they're getting intel. I'd say agents are involved. Like they're getting intel. All right. So you try to gather information, but you have to be careful about how much you actually put in the information. And then what can you trust and what can you rely on?
And if you want to lower your property taxes, by all means, go to OwnWell. The link is in the description below. 86% of customers save money on their property taxes. You don't pay anything up front. You don't pay anything at all unless they lower your property taxes. The average savings is $1,100. I don't know about you, but I like getting $1,100 back in my pocket, or I guess never leaving my pocket if you see me in the street, I don't walk around with $1,100. All right. That's not my walk around money. Yeah, and one thing he talks about is being open and adaptable to how things are going to play out on draft day. And we know this about Nick. He said one thing at one point where, and I don't have the clip here, but he said that our draft board is probably smaller than a lot of teams, which made me think, yeah, this feels like another. Nick's definitely going to be trading, and maybe they have a smaller number of guys that they really, really like. Now, I don't know if that's higher in the draft or midway through the draft. It does make. When you hear the GM say that, yeah, they monitor the mock drafts, and I think more exclusively they might monitor guys like Daniel Jeremiah, Nate Tice, who I've mentioned on here a bunch of times, and maybe some of the articles they write. There are guys that you can trust when they talk, when they say that they've spoken to other executives, or when they reference, I've had disagreements about this guy with this one GM, whereas another GM likes him. So I think you got to be careful in how far you dig into all of that. The other part that I think was interesting was he mentioned about how much they use the top 30 visits or the on-campus visits to maybe have the player explain how he was supposed to operate within a specific system, because the team wants to get a feel for, all right, when I'm watching this, it looks like he's not playing the right technique, but maybe I don't know their scheme or understand that scheme that well. And that's a stark departure from the way the new Jaguars GM, the Magnificent Gladstone, operates, where they don't have any of the 30 visits allotted. They don't bring anybody in because they just want to use other things. I like the way Nick does it. As long as you don't read too much into the personality side of things or think that you can figure out a human being in a short visit. But if you get some of that actual X's and O's stuff, I like that. When it comes to scouting smaller school talent, how do you go about that? This is particularly poignant for Texans fans because Gray Zabal, Charles Grant, a few other guys, but those two offensive linemen especially come from smaller schools. And Nick Caserio, as we know, has only ever drafted, since he's been with the Texans, one now non-Power 5 conference guy, and that's only on a technicality because it was Tank Dell from the University of Houston the year before that year they would enter the Big 12, but Tank Dell didn't play in the Big 12. So how do you go about scouting the smaller school guys?
The nature of the draft, in the end, there's a projection element, regardless of how much a player has or has not played. when you're playing at a lower level, quote unquote, a lower level, there's obviously going to be an adjustment period that takes place. So is there an opportunity to evaluate that, like you said, in the Senior Bowl or East West or something like that? I mean, I'd say those two games done a pretty good job of maybe bringing in some lower level, smaller school players, but it's a huge jump. There's no question about it. So how are they going to handle it? I'd say, going back to, Duggar, there's another example in New England, basically small school kid. I mean, they were playing against like the 20 of us in this room, like basically nobody. And then, went to the Senior Bowl, and I'm including myself in that equation. And then, went to the Senior Bowl and did okay. So is there some evidence along the way? But so you have to, again, it's all right. Here's the player. Here's what we think he does well. You might have to not downgrade it based on the level of competition, but there's a little bit difference, what the guy does against LSU versus what he does against, Western Tennessee State or somebody like that, if that's who they're playing every week. So you're not going to eliminate a player, but, give him an opportunity. But, not every player can make that jump. So, I mean, it's case by case like a lot of this is, but there's a projection element that's involved. No question about it.
Yeah. You know what? I'm glad you brought this up, King Cole. I wasn't in attendance. I would have had to have an issue with him with that. Yeah, to Nick's credit, I think he would have pointed me out, or if ND Kalu or somebody was in there, I think he would have said, okay, except for you, ND or Seth. But I'll give him a pass because he included himself in that. This is it's been the biggest surprise for me. Not that I even gave much thought about it, but if you had asked me when Caserio came here and how much he might bring from New England and operate in the same way that he did in New England when it comes to small school guys, I would have thought, yeah, New England was famous for drafting small school guys. Sometimes their first two picks in a draft would be small school guys. And that, Nick himself having come from a smaller college, or maybe a little bit of a chip on his shoulder about the small school guys, that I would have expected him to draft more smaller school guys. It makes sense now, and I think knowing the way he operates, if you think about maybe one of the differences between drafting Derek Stingley and Sauce Gardner, based on everything Nick Caserio has said about other players and his process, is he liked having Derek Stingley, not just the film of him in the SEC, but Derek Stingley and film of him versus Jamar Chase and all those other great wide receivers at LSU. You could go down and see a lot of sample size of him operating versus those guys. Gray Zabel's a tricky one because, man, it's really easy to watch Gray Zabel in the Senior Bowl. And I succumb to this too and think, okay, boy, he's unpolished with his technique and his footwork on the inside. But when he does it well, he does it really, really well. But that's not the same as consistently doing it week after week versus really good talent. So I think then it almost becomes, all right, if he were able to do all those things, is this a guy that I think would actually be a top 15 type of talent? And that way I can feel good about taking him at 25 because, man, even though he doesn't have the consistency, he looks a lot better than a lot of freshmen or sophomores or young guys in the SEC do. I'm still on the fence about it. I tend to think, I still suspect that Caserio probably marks guys down just based on his track record of not drafting smaller school guys, maybe more so than other teams do. And that it's, if he's looking at Tyler Booker versus Gray Zabel, I don't know. My gut tells me that he's going to like Tyler Booker, but I could be completely wrong on that. Fourth clip. My notes and everything are all over the place because I just cut these up as soon as he was done. Okay. On best player available, do you feel, I think Aaron Wilson asked something along the lines of, do you feel like you did a job in the offseason of completing the roster so you feel like you can go for best player available?
Yeah. Well, we've never drafted for Nate around here. I mean, we're never going to. So we're going to pick the best player that we feel fits our program, regardless of the position. I'd say other than quarterback. I mean, I'd say pretty much any position's on the table.
Okay, so now this is the debate you always have to have with any GM about any GM whenever he says that is, all right, do we 100% believe him? Because it sure does feel like a whole lot of teams end up with a guy, at a position of need, especially in the first round. With Nick, it gets a little bit trickier just because we don't have a huge body of work with his first round picks because the first year he's here, he didn't have anybody. He had Davis Mills. Second year, he took Derek Stingley and Kenyon Green, one on defense, one on offense. I mean, almost every position was a position of need that year. And then, you have the CJ Stroud and Will Anderson at the top of the draft. It felt like if Will Anderson had played any position but had that same profile, and D'Amico saw those personality traits and everything, that was as much about really getting a guy that they loved to trade up that aggressively. Yes, it was a position of need, and then he excused quarterbacks from the equation. And those are your first round picks. I think sometimes what you can do as a GM is that you're taking the best player available on your board, but the board is tweaked a little bit by your team needs and maybe what your team needs. So you can say legitimately, yeah, on draft day, we took the best player available, but the board had already been tweaked a little bit, that it was more heavily weighted towards offensive linemen. I don't know. Some teams do it that way. I don't know if Nick does, but the other part of it is too, man, if you need an offensive lineman, and okay, Nick will talk about bands of players, and there's a band of offensive linemen that we like right up around 17 or 18. Let's get up into that band, and then we'll stick to our board and we'll take the best player available. But on our board, 17, 18, 19, 20 are all offensive linemen. And that would explain a lot of if on draft day you start to see some of these offensive linemen start to slip or fall and the Texans trade up, it's going to be for either an offensive lineman or a wide receiver. That'll be our test. When they trade aggressively, if they trade aggressively in the first round, is he going by best player available at that point? Let's see. Next clip I've got here is, okay. Landry Locker asked the question. I think I have Landry's whole question in here, so I'll let him ask the question.
Going back to the offensive line and the process, you guys have had the most invested, or among the top of the league, most invested in the offensive line, and it really kind of hasn't translated on the field. Given that, outside of getting rid of players and coaches, does that process maybe require a little bit more tweaking than other processes, given what the results have been based on the investment?
Yeah, we always look at everything. So, just try to make the decisions that we feel, are in the best interest of the team. It's always case by case. Each year is going to be a little bit different. So contracts are contracts. It's just part of the process. So we'll look at everything. And if there's something that we feel we can improve, we'll look at it. And if not, then, we'll kind of keep moving forward. So I don't think there's anything, wholesale that we feel like we got to do, that much differently.
And somebody who must have gotten to the press conference later asked the exact same question, and Nick did not expand on that any further. For one, they haven't put together a good offensive line. I don't think Nick would shy away from that. I think, if you had a blunt conversation with him away from a press conference, we wish we'd had better offensive lines since I was here. In terms of change in the process, the 35,000 foot view is, I think they've addressed the fact that they got to change something in the offensive line. They fired the offensive coordinator. The offensive line coach was probably going to retire, but I don't think he was coming back either. And 3 of your starting offensive linemen gone. So that's 5 critical people heavily involved with the offensive line that are just gone and out of there. And the only real veteran you kept was Titus Howard. You got a bunch of young and promising guys after that. So there's 2 scenarios. There's one, on the football side of things, they got to do a better job of getting the most out of the talent they do have. I tend to be maybe unpopularly less critical of Nick and his ability to draft offensive linemen, just because they haven't really spent a whole lot of picks on offensive linemen, high picks. Kenyon Green was a mistake. It was a flat out mistake, or it was a bad pick. It was in a draft where he also he drafted Derek Stingley, but that's on the defensive side of the ball. God. If he could draft offensive linemen the way he's drafted defensive backs, the Texans would have won 2 Super Bowls already. But that might be a little aggressive. But when it comes to Jarrett Patterson and Juice Scruggs, I'm still waiting, and I want to see how they do in this system with this offensive coordinator. And Jarrett Patterson was a late round pick. 6th round picks have about a 15% hit rate. So I'm not judging him harshly there. Blake Fisher, I'm not making any judgments on Blake Fisher yet. So Kenyon Green is the draft pick that right now really stings. I think with Juice Scruggs and Jarrett Patterson, the one question I might have is, neither of those guys really profile like a guy that in a zone running system is that athletic center that can really get out and reach a 3 technique or a really cocked wide nose tackle. And I just wondered about what kind of a scheme fit those guys are for the Texans offense that they were running. I think this year's offense might feature more runs and a different style of play that benefits Jarrett Patterson and Juice Scruggs more. Might have benefited Kenyon Green more too, but I think that ship had just simply sailed. Kenyon Green was a pretty long reach IMO. And yet, though, it was okay. I don't think it was a reach at all by their draft board. So I think, yes, by a lot of people's thoughts that they thought Kenyon Green was a reach, they traded back when they felt like, by Nick's philosophy, I think, and inaccurately so, they had those 3 players, Jordan What's-His-Face, the defensive tackle, Kyle Hamilton, and Kenyon Green, probably in the same band. I think the trade back might actually be more of an indicator they were drafting for need there, that they thought, all right, well, we like all these guys. We need an offensive lineman. Maybe Kenyon Green was a little lower. So we'll never know all the answers to these unless the Texans win like 7 Super Bowls and there are multiple books written about them.